Louis, thank you for spending time talking to us and answering our questions. Yours is a story of a generation of people that most of us here can only imagine in our wildest nightmares. And yet, if we don't ask you these questions, and you're not willing to speak out, a whole generation of us won't know what we kind of need to know, which is sort of the dark truth of something that happened that we hope will never happen again. We know in the world it has since happened again. We want to find ways to prevent it from happening. And one of the ways is just essentially to start by finding out what your story is. So you're a teenager. What's life like before this happens to you?
Well, Czechoslovakia was a democratic state. Jewish people lived in relative freedom with opportunity, all the opportunities for education and to become prosperous. However, all that changed when in 1939, Czechoslovakia became a part of the Hungarian government. So that's when things changed. I attended for 8 years the Hebrew Gymnasium of Munkács, which was a very well-known, unique, only of its kind institution in Eastern Europe at the time.
Tell us your mother and father's names.
My father was Zalman, and my mother was Henche. My father was a shoemaker who
And how many sisters?
barely made a living. They had 6 children.
6 children.
Lived in a 2-room house.
When things started to turn for the worse, today we'd go on YouTube or Google and we'd see it. But back then, how did you begin to hear the winds of war?
Unfortunately, Hitler was everywhere. Every day you could hear his speeches over the radio. You couldn't help avoiding them.
How much time did you have to plan to get away, or did you plan to get away?
No. And, people always ask me,
Thank you.
how come, why did you stick around? Why did you? Well, it's very hard to leave a country where your ancestors have been residing for the past 200 or 300 years, number one. Number two, I don't believe my father could have gotten together enough change to have put all of us on a train to go anywhere.
So when did you leave, and where did you go?
I was taken away at the time I became of military age. All male personnel had to report for military duty, regardless whether you were a Jew or a Gentile. By the way, Hungary was the last one to have handed the Jews over to Hitler. While most of Europe's Jews were already exterminated, we were still living in relative safety. Hungary was the only country where Jews were still walking around without having to wear a yellow star or a yellow band. However, our life was restricted to a certain degree, but life was manageable. All the way up until 1944, the spring of 1944, when Hungary decided they wanted out of the alliance. It was a losing proposition. They were losing the battle in Russia, and they wanted out. And that's when the Germans occupied the country. And that's when the Holocaust started.
Did you go thinking you were signing up for the military?
I had to sign up. This was compulsory sign up. And I was drafted at the fall of 1942. When I got there, the only difference was if you were a Jew, you were given a shovel. And of course, if you were a Gentile, you were given military training. We were there for a few days, and on the second or third day, they lined us all up, and the commander gave us the usual speech about Arbeit macht frei, if you work hard, you'll be okay. And he then belted out an order saying that all shoemakers should take one step forward. I looked down the line, up and down, and there must have been 500 shoemakers. Well, it's very obvious why so many have volunteered, because if you are chosen to be a shoemaker, you would not be working in the outdoors in a snowstorm or rainstorm. You would have to be in a sheltered area.
You said your dad was a shoemaker. Had he taught you the trade?
No, I did not know a thing about it. Not at all.
But you stepped forward?
I stepped forward. And then he started marching down the line, and he chose about 4 or 5 cabinet makers, 4 or 5 tailors, and eventually, as he kept marching, when he was still at the shoemaker, and that was the first indication that I had a chance for survival. And that meant I remained on the place while 95 or 99% of all the others were shipped to the Russian front, where they all perished, of course, under conditions that were beyond.
Did you end up making shoes?
Among the 4 or 5 shoemakers that were approved, there was only 2 of them that were true shoemakers. And they covered for us.
They taught you?
I managed to kind of survive there.
How many people were you housed with? How many prisoners were with you?
Well, we were not even considered prisoners because we were relatively free. We were allowed on the Sabbath to go into town for services. It was amazing.
Were you scared?
Of course, we were always scared.
You were?
Because some of the sergeants were very mean and crude with us and always threatened us with all kinds of things unless we did things the way they wanted it and all that stuff. But life was very, very bearable. I was very, very lucky. This was 1 in a million. This is unbelievable.
How did you treat each other, your fellow Jews? Did you realize that you were surviving together?
Oh my God, of course, because you have to remember, we knew what was going on in the rest of the world, also not much, but whatever we did know, it was obviously terrible.
So you did this, you said, for how long, 2 years?
I did that from the fall of 42 till the spring of 44.
And then what happened?
And that's when the Germans moved in, the Hungarians opened up the gates, and they said, "You're free to go." And I didn't know what to do, but there were some rumors that there were some passes available issued by the papacy and by the Swiss government and by the Swedish government for some shelters in Budapest. So we just went to Budapest, and when we got there, I just didn't know where to turn, where to go, where I would find those things. And eventually I was arrested on the street, and that's when my Holocaust experience started.
You went to Budapest and you were arrested?
Arrested on the street. They arrested us, they rounded us up, a bunch of us. They made us drop our pants, and the moment they saw I was circumcised, there was no question that you were a Jew. And they then rounded us up and put us on cattle cars, and we headed to the Austro-Hungarian border. And there by the way, by that time the Russians were already approaching the Hungarian border, and they started building enforcements on the border of Austria and Hungary. And they made us dig the ditches for the tank enforcements, tank trenches and all that stuff. And of course, the conditions were unbearable. before you knew it, winter came around. We were sheltered in tents. We were fed very, very little. We were actually, I would say the conditions turned similar to what they were in Auschwitz.
How was your health throughout all this period? Did you get sick?
Well, you see, that's another thing. The fact that I was well and well cared for all those years gave me a head start as opposed to the others who have been suffering or been at it for a long time. So I was in pretty good shape at the time, and I managed to survive. But it was very, very important not to get hurt, not to get sick.
At this point, you're living in tents. Are most of the people you're with young men who survived?
All young people, yes. Most of them, because I remember these were all slave laborers in the Hungarian system. And eventually the Russians were approaching, and they put us on a train again, and we ended up somewhere around Vienna. And in Vienna, they again put us on a train and took us off the train, and we started what they call the Death March. And I walked the whole length of Austria, from Vienna all the way to Linz, or to all the way, the whole length of Austria.
Which would be
in
how many
the
miles?
winter of 1944-45.
How many miles would that be to you?
Oh my God, 1,000 kilometers.
I want to go back to the tents at night before we get to the march. So you have tent mates, right? You don't have your own tent. How many people are in a tent with you?
I would say about 10, 15 people. Every morning we got up, there were always at least one or two dead bodies. They didn't make it through the night. And they always asked for volunteers to remove those bodies. And of course, I was little enough to always being able to hide in the back, so I was never chosen to volunteer. And that helped. And those bodies were then taken outside the tent and then placed on a cart and disposed of. And this was going on day after day after day.
What was going through your mind at night?
I don't remember. All I can tell you, that never, even in the worst conditions, did I ever think that I would not make it. And that, I think, was very important.
So you believed you'd survive this hell on earth. Were you praying at night?
No.
Had you
I was not praying.
Had you lost faith in God at this point?
I didn't go that far, but I did not. It was not, I would say it was not an issue at the time.
5 years ago, I had the chance to interview Elie Wiesel. When I asked him, did you lose faith in God? He said, no, but my faith is a forever wounded faith. Is that the same for you?
To a certain degree, I must admit. You know, we came from a not very religious, there were two groups of Jews in my hometown. There were the very, very religious ones, and then there were conservative. There were no reform. Now, I belonged to the conservative group, and I personally truly believed in God. I thought that if any German would ever enter the space of the temple, he would explode in a ball of fire. He wouldn't dare to come in there, and things like that. And I was, by the way, I was very well learned in Hebrew. I went to Hebrew Gymnasium. I went to Cheder. I learned Talmud, Gemara. I was quite interested in that. And I would say, I was a firm believer. As Jews, for somehow or other, we accepted our punishment as if we had it coming. I mean it. How come I didn't question? How come I didn't question whatever authority, whether the divine or anybody? Why is this happening to me? Why is it happening? The fact that I was a Jew, that's why it's happening.
Did you ever ask the question, I'm sure children you speak to ask you the question, where do you believe God was during all this time?
I didn't think of God so much. I was thinking more of where were the other nations at that time.
What were the other nations? Yeah.
Yeah. Where was America? I always somehow believed, well, maybe they haven't found out. Maybe they don't know it. One of these days they've got to come and rescue us. And had I known what was going on, I'm glad I didn't know.
You would have been angry at that.
Yeah, I would have been very angry. Yes.
So back to your story, you're in the 1,000-kilometer march.
One of the things that I was always concerned about is when a new branch joined us in our march, I hoped not to run into a surviving sibling. Now, why would
You
I?
hope not to?
Not to.
Why?
Now, why would I wish that? From my experience and what my brother told me, by the way, my brother and his father were sharing a bunk at Birkenau, a bunker in Birkenau. And every night when the bread, the shares of the food was brought in, the portion of the food was brought in, his father kept forcing a larger piece of the bread on his son. And of course, his son didn't want to take that. And these arguments went on, day after day. And he kept saying, my son, you're only 15 years old. Please have a bigger piece of the bread. I already have lived long enough. I'm 45. And this went on. And eventually they got separated. And he said it was such a relief when he got separated, because survival under those circumstances was just impossible.
So
And I know that I have witnessed this kind of behavior all along in the tents, by the way. They made us lie down every night, sometimes shelters, sometimes no shelters. And we were just lying outside in the snow. And in the morning, when they rounded us up, woke us up, whoever couldn't get up was just shot at sight and just left dead. You know, that's the reason I hope I would not run into someone close to me.
Did you run into people you knew throughout this walk?
Interestingly enough, listen, to survive what I went through would have been impossible without some divine or whatever intervention. There was a fellow from my hometown who I hardly knew, and he kind of joined me. He was a bigger hunk of a man, and every time he ran into the field to find an abandoned potato or a kohlrabi or something, he always brought two of them and shared it always with me. And I believe he helped me so much to survive. And as a matter of fact, the fellow that was so helpful, I went to Israel because I knew his name, and he had some surviving family, and I specifically made a detour in Israel to find out what happened to him, and they didn't know. So chances are he may not have survived. By the way, Germans, they say they didn't know what was happening. Not only didn't they know what was happening, they were cruel. We were marching on the roads, and they were walking on the sidewalks. They always looked at us as if we were carrying the plague. But there was one instant I must mention. During the death march, I was accompanied by an old guard, and he suddenly kind of touched my arm alongside me, and he handed me a hot potato. I will never, never forget that. That was the only kindness that the Germans have ever shown me, at least, anyway.
Even this one instance of kindness obviously was worth a lot more than one potato to you.
Well, oh my God, meant an awful lot. And also, you have to remember also what your view was. As I mentioned before, that I have never thought of that I would not make it. For some reason, in the worst condition. I remember turning.
I want to stop you. You've said that twice, and every time you say that, my brain screams, why? Why would you
I'm
have
marching.
such a belief?
Listen, I was marching, and we made a turn in the road, and suddenly it was a morning, sunny day, and suddenly the first sight of the mountains, you know, the tall mountains in Europe, the Alps, a peak of the Alps appeared with the sun shining on top of it, which was snow-covered. It was just magnificent. And I look up and I said to my fellow marcher, look at this, isn't this beautiful? And he says to me, you must be insane. So you see, I somehow even...
You chose to see the beauty.
I thought that there was still something worthwhile living for.
How long did you march this march?
I ended up in Mauthausen in the March of 1944. We ended up in a camp called Günskirchen, which is adjacent to Mauthausen. And there they just laid us out in some open bunkers. They didn't feed us, they didn't give us any water, they didn't do anything. We were just waiting for us to die. And that's where I was liberated a couple of days later, eventually.
And any idea how many of you were liberated?
Oh my God. You couldn't tell who was dead and who was alive. It was just, I don't know how many were. It was just awesome.
All these years later, you sound, you're 93 years old, right?
95.
95?
Yes.
I thought you were 93 when I met you. You gained 2 years.
That was
You're
3 years ago.
95 years old. You've got a twinkle
Well,
in your
wait,
eye.
This is only half my story.
Well, I don't know, but I just want to, I realize that. I just want to know what kind of a constitution you must have to not only be able to tell the story, but to have a smile on your face as you do it.
Well, that does it, the smile. Smile does it. And it doesn't cost you anything either.
By the way, something else, Elie Wiesel said throughout his war experience, somehow, miraculously, he never got sick. And ever since he's been free, he's been prone to one little blow of cold wind and he gets a cold. Are you still healthy all the time? Have you had a
I
healthy
have
adult life?
major issues, but I don't have little issues. No.
Okay. So when you were liberated, did you have any fear you'd be captured again by somebody else?
No. At that point, I didn't worry about it. As a matter of fact, we were liberated sometimes during the night, and we were told, the Americans are here, the Americans are here. So I had always had somebody from my hometown with me, and we decided that we shouldn't leave the camp until the morning, because we wouldn't know which way to go. And we left the camp, and I was the only one speaking English, able to speak English in the group. So they kind of stuck with me. They wanted to come with me. And we left the camp, and after walking for about 10 minutes, we were stopped by an American patrol, and it was a black unit. And I have never seen a black person in my life. And yet, it absolutely made no difference. I never dawned on me, my God, these are different. They were no different. To me, they were just Americans. And they stopped us and they wanted to know who we were. And I told them who I was. And he says, just keep going, and when you get to town, you'll find food and everything else. And as we approached the first house, I thought maybe we ought to knock on the door. We were so hungry. Maybe knock on the door, ask for a piece of bread. And sure enough, I knock on the door, and an old lady, shaking, trembling, horrified. Says, what can I help you? So I said, bitte schön, kann ich ein Stückchen Brot haben? Please, could I have a piece of bread? And of course, she went in and brought out a piece of bread, and I thanked him for it and just kept marching. We arrived into the city, and of course, there were various organizations already in the working, like UNRWA, the Joint, the various military set up to feed these various refugees that were coming into the cities from all over. Because you have to remember, there are millions of us on the move. There was not only Jewish prisoners, but there were Russian prisoners, prisoners of war, prisoners of work, coming from all over, from almost every country. They herded, those people to work in Germany. So it was a mass of migration and movement of people at the time. And I was around for about a week, and I passed out, and I cannot account what happened to me in the month of June, July. All I know that I woke up sometimes in July, and I thought this is the time to look for
your family?
Family. What happened is that I got typhus. And by the way, my father died in Buchenwald a week or 2 weeks after liberation from typhus. Thousands and thousands of people died from typhus. It was caused by the lice infestation that we couldn't get rid of. They were eating at us for months, sucking our blood, which we could barely spare. It was just awful. And this is what caused that epidemic of typhus, which killed thousands of us.
So you were basically out for 2 months. Where were you at the time?
I was in an army field hospital. It was under American care, obviously, and I must have been recovered. And then I decided now I got to go and start looking for my family, because I had no idea what happened to my family.
Was the thinking to go home to find them?
Decided, to head home and find out what's what. Now, the way it was done, we were traveling from usually capital to capital, because that's where most of the organizations were very active and provided much of the help to those refugees. So when I got to Budapest, for example, and found a joint shelter, which is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee shelter, or an UNRWA shelter, the first thing we got in there was to read the walls of the room, because everybody kept leaving notes written on the wall. My name is so-and-so, I was here on such and such a date. And as people were coming, they were reading the wall and leaving messages for future people that may come around. And that was one way to find out. But I'll tell you the story. What happened, one day I run into someone who tells me that they saw my brother in Prague or something. And I was in, I don't know where. But anyway, I get on the train, I walk through the corridor, look at every compartment. Finally, I find a compartment that was empty. I walk in there, I want to sit down, and the bench is muddy and dirty. Even though I was not very clean, but still, I could not sit down. So I'm looking for something to clean it with. And I look down, and there's a piece of paper, crunch piece of paper on the floor. I pick it up, and as I unfold it, my sister's name appeared on it. And on top, on the heading, this is the list of survivors that were taken to Sweden for medical recuperation. And she was listed on that piece. This is unbelievable. I kept telling this story for a long time, and I was beginning to believe that I made this up. This could not have happened.
Yeah.
And my sweetheart son, Stephen, found a copy of that paper. He works for the American Museum, Jewish Museum in New York City. He found a copy of that paper.
So you believe yourself now?
So now I stopped doubting.
And on that piece of paper, were there a lot of names?
There were a lot of names, yes.
You have any idea what went through your mind when you saw your sister's name?
Oh my God, this was an event that is, you can't imagine. I mean, I can't find a word for that. So I went back to Prague, which was a liberated city and had everything working, postal facility, everything was working. And I sent a telegram to the Swedish Red Cross. And within 24 hours, I got an answer from her.
So,
and she found out about me, and she was asking me about, she didn't know anything about anybody either. Did she ask us, is my father alive, is my son alive? But of course, at that time, I still didn't know about my brother, who I found later.
So of your 5 siblings, how many made it through the war?
We were a family of 8,
Right.
and 3 siblings made it.
3 siblings.
Yeah.
So a sister and a brother and you.
And 3 of them made it, and 3 of them perished. Yeah, the younger ones, the little ones.
At this point, did you then go to Sweden and find your sister right away?
No. She, right away, we started communicating, and she told me that she's in a hospital, was being very well taken care of. You know, the Swedes collaborated with the Germans quite a bit, as you know. They provided them with all the steel they needed throughout the war, and I think this was one way to make up for it. I think they were very generous with those activities.
So you stayed in touch with, did you find your brother first then?
No. So I found her, and then as I continued traveling, I eventually found my brother at home, way at my hometown, where by the way, my 3 children just returned from a trip to my hometown.
Did you go back to that house?
Yes, at that time I went back. I met up with my brother, and of course we didn't want to stay. By that time it was Russia, by the way, Ukraine. I didn't want to stay there. However, I wanted a couple things while I was there. One of them was a birth certificate, and another was my graduation certificate from high school.
Somehow you got from Czechoslovakia, which is now Russia and Ukraine, to Madison.
I came here on a 4-year, fully paid scholarship to the University of Wisconsin.
If there's one question I didn't ask you that
yes.
you'd like me to have asked, what would that question be? What would you want to tell us we didn't cover yet?
About my family.
Okay. Your
We
current
didn't
family?
mention my family. You know why I'm 95 years old?
No.
And what keeps me going is my wonderful family. I have possibly the best. I have 3 children. Stephen is the oldest, Anne is the second, and Rita is the third. Rita and Stephen live in New York City. Anne is a physician. Rita is a pharmacist married to a physician. Stephen is the computer research programmer at the Jewish Museum in New York City. And Rita and Anne have 3 children, Anne and Jeff. Rita has 3 children, and Stephen has 1 child. But then I lost my wife in 1992, and I married the most delightful young lady, Eva, who has been my guiding angel. I have had very major health issues, and she has gotten through me. And her family also has become a part of, a truly organic part of my family. And we are all very, very close and loving. And this is what keeps me going. And that's what you didn't ask me about.
How important is it for you to be telling the story live?
Initially, for years, I did not say anything about it. I did not share the information with my children. But as time went on and we became more and more aware of the fact that it is important that we share this information, if we want to retain the memory of the victims, we should be talking about it. And that's when I slowly kind of eased into it. And I started sharing my stories with my own family and eventually with the public at large.
For everybody in this room and from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for talking with us. I do want to say thank you to the JCC for hosting the event. I want to mention a reason we do this in addition to honoring the survivors and their families, that we all have stories and they validate who we are and where we've come from. So I'm hoping today you will leave with a personal pledge to choose your most important stories, share them with other people, share them with the children in your family, and if you're children in your family, share your stories with the elders in your family. When we hear stories of other people, our lives take on a special meaning. When we share the tales of all of our journeys and we help each other continue on our way, we validate who we are and why we're doing what we're doing. And today, so grateful, Louis, again, to hear your story. Thank you again. Thanks to all of you.